The morning of November 12, 1944, broke grey and cold over the Hürtgen Forest. Rain dripped steadily through the dense fir trees onto German positions south of the Forester's Lodge. Lieutenant Friedrich Lengfeld stood in the mud, listening. His breath came in visible clouds. Around him, the surviving men of 2nd Company huddled in their foxholes, lice-ridden, exhausted, hungry. Then they all heard it. A voice, crying out from the wild sow minefield. An American soldier, wounded, alone in no man's land between the German and American lines. The cries for help continued. Hour after hour. No one came for him. The Americans had retreated in disarray after the counterattack. Either they believed he was dead, or they could not reach him through the maze of anti-personnel mines that gave the field its name, Wild Boar. Lengfeld listened to the screaming. At some point in those hours, something shifted in the young German lieutenant. He stopped hearing the voice of an alti, enemy. He heard a human being drowning in pain. At approximately 10:30 in the morning, Lengfeld made a decision that would echo across 5 decades. He ordered his communications runner, Hürtgen Forest, to find the machine gun team guarding the mine-free path beside the minefield. The order was clear. Do not fire on any American medics who might come to rescue this man. Then Lengfeld assembled his own rescue team. They put on Red Cross vests. They followed him down the road, carefully avoiding the anti-tank mines whose positions they knew. They could see the American now, lying on the embankment on the eastern side of the road, in the middle of the minefield. Lengfeld moved to cross the road toward him. He stepped off the safe path. The anti-personnel mine detonated with a sharp crack. The explosion tore 2 deep holes in his back. Shrapnel peppered his body. His leg was shredded. The rescue team stared in shock as their commander collapsed. They rushed him back to the lodge, but the damage was catastrophic. The internal injuries were beyond what field medicine could address. They transported him to the aid station at Lucasmühle. Later that evening, at the main casualty station in Freutzheim, Lieutenant Friedrich Lengfeld died. He was 23 years old. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The wounded American's fate remains unknown. Gaze speculated that the man might have saved himself, crawling back to American lines before the area was recaptured by German forces the next day. No American records identify who he was. No unit rosters note a soldier lost and recovered from that specific location. The man Lengfeld died trying to save disappeared into the fog of war, one unnamed casualty among tens of thousands in that terrible forest. For 50 years, Lengfeld's sacrifice existed only in the memories of the men who had been there. Hürtgen Forest carried the story. A few German veterans knew what their lieutenant had done. But to the Americans who fought in the Hürtgen Forest, Lengfeld was just another German officer, another enemy, another name that meant nothing. Then, in 1994, on the 50th anniversary of that November day, something extraordinary happened. American veterans of the 22nd Infantry Regiment gathered at the Hürtgen War Cemetery in Germany. Led by retired Major General John Ruggles, who had served as regimental executive officer during the battle, these men had come to erect a monument, but they were not honouring one of their own. They were honouring the German lieutenant who had fought against them. The monument stands near the cemetery entrance, among 3,000 German graves. The inscription reads, "No man hath greater love than he who layeth down his life for his enemy." It is possibly the only memorial erected by American soldiers to honour a German officer's act, bravery during combat. To understand why American veterans would build such a monument requires going back to the beginning, to the man Friedrich Lengfeld was before that November morning. He was born September 29, 1921, in Grünfelde, a village in East Prussia. His early life remains largely undocumented. His parents are unknown. His education is unrecorded. What is known comes from his military service record and the inscription on his dog tag, which suggests he belonged initially to the staff of the Gebirgsjäger Ersatzbataillon in Mittenwald, part of the 8th Mountain Division. By 1944, Lengfeld had been assigned to the 275th Infantry Division, formed in France earlier that year. He served as a lieutenant, eventually taking command of 2nd Company of the Divisional Fusilier Battalion after his company commander was killed in October. His service on the Eastern Front had been marked by repeated wounds. He received awards for his actions. According to Hubert Gies, who served as Lengfeld's dispatcher and runner, the lieutenant never told his men, "Go on." He always said, "Follow me." He led from the front, through constant threats from Allied troops, through the grinding attrition of defensive warfare. By November 1944, Lengfeld's company was defending a sector south of the town of Hürtgen. The men were in desperate condition. They had not bathed in days, perhaps weeks. Everyone suffered from lice infestations. The cold was severe, made worse by constant rain and snow that soaked through uniforms and turned foxholes into muddy pits. They were fighting over a forester's lodge that changed hands repeatedly, shelter so important that men died for the right to huddle inside its crumbling walls. The lodge sat beside the wild sow minefield, named for the wild boars that had once roamed the forest. The minefield was extensive, one of the largest, protecting the Price Siegfried Line. Anti-personnel mines were scattered throughout, supplemented by anti-tank mines along the road. The Germans had laid them carefully, creating overlapping fields of fire, zones of death that would stop any American advance. A path ran beside the minefield, relatively safe if you knew where to step, guarded by a German machine gun position. On the afternoon of November 2nd, 1944, Lengfeld's unit had established a defensive line running from the Wild Sow minefield westward. The American attack came from the 109th Infantry Regiment. The fighting was brutal. Artillery struck constantly. The Forester's Lodge was captured by American forces of the 12th Infantry on the evening of November 10th. Lengfeld lost more men. He rallied the survivors and launched a counterattack the following morning. They drove the Americans out. But in the chaos of the American withdrawal, one soldier ran directly into the Wild Sow. The mines did not kill him, instantly. He lay there, severely wounded, crying for help. This was the context in which Lengfeld made his decision. This was the world that shaped his choice to attempt a rescue. The Hürtgen Forest by November 1944 was not a place where humanity flourished. It was a place where men died by the hundreds for yards of worthless ground, where tree bursts from artillery shells sent wooden splinters slicing through bodies like shrapnel, where the wounded froze to death in foxholes because evacuation was impossible, where soldiers on both sides suffered from trench foot so severe their boots had to be cut off, where combat exhaustion broke men's minds as surely as shrapnel broke their bodies. The Americans called it Passchendaele with tree bursts, comparing it to the worst killing ground of World War I. Historian John S.D. Eisenhower wrote that the battle stands in history, comparable to the Argonne. It was a place that tested everything a man believed about duty, honor, and what one human being owed another. The forest consumed divisions, it devoured regiments, it took ideals and ground them into the mud. The Hürtgen Forest battle had begun in September 1944 as part of Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges' First Army drive to reach the Rhine River. American commanders saw the forest as a threat to their flank during the push toward Aachen. The logic seemed simple: clear the forest, eliminate the threat, continue the advance. But the Hürtgen was not simple. It was a 50-square-mile inverted triangle of dense woodland, steep ravines, and narrow paths. Visibility was limited to a few yards in any direction. The thick canopy prevented effective air support. Tanks and tank destroyers could only operate on roads, and the roads were mined. The Germans defending the forest understood its value perfectly. They could hold up an entire American army with relatively few troops if they used the terrain properly. They laid minefields at every choke point, They positioned machine guns to cover fire breaks. They zeroed in artillery on every road intersection, every clearing, every possible avenue of approach. When American troops advanced, German artillery observers called in fire that burst in the treetops, raining steel and wood splinters down on men who could not see where the shells were coming from. The American 9th Infantry Division entered the forest first, in September 1944. After several weeks of combat, they had advanced 3,000 yards at a cost of 4,500 casualties. That is 1 casualty for every 2 feet of ground gained. The division was pulled out, combat ineffective. The 28th Infantry Division went in next in early November. On November 2nd, they launched a major assault toward the town of Schmidt. Initially successful, the attack disintegrated under German counterattacks. The 312th Infantry Regiment was shattered. By November 10th, the division had suffered casualties that destroyed its fighting effectiveness. 2 regiments lost the equivalent of 100% of their fighting strength. Then it was the 4th Infantry Division's turn. The Ivy Division had stormed Utah Beach on D-Day, June 6, 1944. They had fought through Normandy, through France, earning a reputation as one of the best infantry divisions in the army. The 22nd Infantry Regiment, part of the 4th Division, was commanded by Colonel Charles T. Lanham, a 42-year-old West Point graduate known for leading from the front. His regimental motto was, "Deeds, not words." Lanham told his officers, "As officers, I expect you to lead your men. Men will follow a leader, and I expect my platoon leaders to be right up front. Losses could be very high. Use every skill you possess. If you survive your first battle, I'll promote you. Good luck." The 22nd Infantry entered the Hürtgen Forest on November 16, 1944. Writer Ernest Hemingway, attached to the regiment as a correspondent, described the coming battle as Passchendaele with tree bursts. The regiment was responsible for a 3-mile front. Their objective was to push through the forest to the Ruhr River plain, 5 miles ahead. On the morning of November 16th, the lead companies waded across the Rotaway stream and began climbing the fir-covered ridge. Within 3 days, the 22nd Infantry had lost all 3 battalion commanders. The attrition rate among rifle company officers exceeded 300%. On the 6th day of fighting, November 21st, the regiment suffered 50% casualties in a single day. By November 20th, the rifle companies had lost more than 40% of their strength. The regiment reported 700 casualties, representing over 40% of their combat strength. Replacements arrived for enlisted men, but few officer replacements were available. The regiment continued fighting, depleted, exhausted, grinding forward yard by yard through mud and mines, and the constant artillery fire that turned the forest into hell. This was the battle Friedrich Lengfeld was fighting. This was the meat grinder that consumed American and German soldiers alike. And in the middle of this industrial-scale slaughter, one German lieutenant heard a wounded American crying for help and decided that saving him mattered more than survival. The specifics of what Lengfeld faced that morning must be understood in material terms. The Wild Sow minefield was not a random scattering of explosives. It was a carefully engineered killing zone. German combat engineers had laid anti-personnel mines throughout the area, devices designed to maim rather than kill. A shoe mine 39, the standard German anti-personnel mine, contained 200 grams of TNT in a wooden box that was nearly impossible to detect with metal detectors. When triggered by as little as 11 pounds of pressure, the mine detonated upward, sending wooden splinters and steel fragments into legs, groin, abdomen. The wounds were catastrophic. Survival required immediate medical attention that was often impossible to provide in combat conditions. The Germans had also placed Telemine 42s throughout the area, anti-tank mines containing 5.5 kilograms of TNT. These were positioned along the road and in areas where vehicles might attempt to bypass obstacles. The combination created a defensive system where infantry could not advance and armor could not support them. Additional complexity came from anti-lifting devices attached to many mines. An engineer attempting to remove a mine would trigger a secondary explosion. The Germans had learned these techniques from years of defensive fighting on the Eastern Front. They brought that expertise to the Hürtgen Forest. The path beside the minefield that Lengfeld used to approach the wounded American was secured by a machine gun position. The weapon was almost certainly an MG-42, the standard German general-purpose machine gun. With a cyclic rate of 1,200 rounds per minute, the MG-42 could put down sustained fire that would cut apart any rescue attempt from the American side. The gun's effective range was 1,000 meters. At the distances involved in the Wild Sow rescue attempt, the machine gun could have killed any American rescue party in seconds. Lengfeld's order to withhold fire was therefore significant. It meant temporarily surrendering a tactical advantage, giving up the ability to inflict casualties on the enemy for the possibility of saving one wounded man. The rescue team Lengfeld assembled wore Red Cross markings. Under the Geneva Conventions, medical personnel were supposed to be protected from deliberate fire. In practice, this protection was often ignored, particularly in the chaos of close-quarters forest fighting. Medical corpsmen on both sides understood that the Red Cross, painted on their helmets or displayed on armbands, made them targets as often as it protected them. Enemy forces recognized that killing medics meant wounded soldiers would not be evacuated, would not return to combat, would die in foxholes. The calculus of industrial warfare made medics legitimate targets despite international law. Lengfeld himself wore the standard uniform of a Wehrmacht infantry officer, field grey wool tunic and trousers, already soaked through from the constant rain, leather boots that were never truly dry, a steel helmet that provided minimal protection against artillery fragments. He carried no special equipment for mine clearance. He had no detector, no probing tools, no engineer training for this specific task. He simply knew the general layout of the minefield from his unit's defensive planning. He knew where the anti-tank mines along the road were positioned. He did not know where every anti-personnel mine had been placed. That information had been lost in the chaos of repeated attacks and counterattacks over the previous days. The physical act of attempting the rescue was therefore not just dangerous, but nearly suicidal. Lengfeld walked into a minefield where every step could trigger an explosion. He did this in daylight, visible to any American observers who might not recognize the Red Cross markings or might shoot anyway out of fear or confusion. He did this while exhausted, malnourished, probably suffering from the early stages of trench foot like most soldiers who had been in the forest for weeks. His decision was not made from a position of strength or safety. It was made from a position of complete vulnerability, with full knowledge of the likely outcome. The explosion that killed Lengfeld occurred at approximately 10:30 on the morning of November 12th. Hubert Gies, who witnessed it, provided the only detailed account of what happened in those final moments. Gies described Lengfeld leading the rescue team down the road beside the minefield, successfully avoiding the anti-tank mines. They moved carefully, following the path they knew to be relatively safe. The wounded American was visible now, lying on the embankment on the eastern side of the road, still crying out for help. Lengfeld reached the point opposite where the American lay. To reach him, the lieutenant had to leave the safe path and cross into the minefield proper. There was no other way. The wounded soldier was in the middle of the Wild Sow, surrounded by mines. Lengfeld stepped off the road. The mine detonated immediately. The blast caught him in the lower body and back. Gies saw his commander go down. The rescue team rushed forward, staying on the safe path, and pulled Lengfeld back to the lodge. The wounds were immediately recognizable as fatal. 2 holes in Lengfeld's back, each roughly the size of a coin, indicated severe internal injuries. The explosion had driven fragments deep into Satea, his torso. His leg was shredded, barely attached. Blood loss was massive. In the cramped, unsanitary conditions of the Foresters' Lodge, there was no possibility of effective treatment. The German medics did what they could, applying field dressings, trying to stabilize him for transport. But everyone present understood the reality. These were wounds that required immediate surgery in a fully equipped hospital. That facility was hours away through forest roads under constant American artillery fire. They transported Lengfeld first to the aid station at Lucasmühle, a mill building that had been converted into a forward medical facility. The journey itself, over rough forest tracks in a vehicle without proper suspension, must have been agonizing. At Lucasmühle, medical personnel confirmed what the field medics already knew. The internal injuries were beyond their capability to treat. They stabilized Lengfeld as best they could and sent him further back to the main casualty station at Freutzheim, several miles to the east. Lengfeld remained conscious during much of this. Guise reported that the lieutenant moaned in great pain. This detail is significant. It means Lengfeld was aware of what had happened, aware that he was dying, aware that the American soldier he had tried to save remained in the minefield. There is no record of what Lengfeld said during those hours. No final words were preserved. No dramatic last statement exists in the historical record. He simply endured the pain as his body shut down from trauma and blood loss. At the main casualty station in Freutzheim, doctors attempted surgery. The facility was better equipped than the forward aid stations, but still operating under wartime conditions with limited supplies and overwhelming numbers of casualties. The surgeons opened Lengfeld's back and found the damage extensive. The explosion had torn through organs, severed blood vessels, created internal injuries that could not be repaired with the resources available. Late that evening, probably around 8 or 9 o'clock, Lieutenant Friedrich Lengfeld died on the operating table. He was 23 years old. He had been a commissioned officer for less than 3 years. He had survived combat on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Army. He had taken command of 2nd Company only weeks earlier when his commander was killed, and he died attempting to save an enemy soldier he had never met. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The wounded American's fate remains one of the great unknowns of this story. No American unit reported recovering a wounded soldier from the Wild Sow minefield on November 12th or 13th. No casualty reports from the 12th Infantry Regiment match the circumstances. Guise speculated that the man might have crawled back to American lines before German forces reoccupied the area. The broader context of Lengfeld's death reveals why this moment mattered. The Battle of Hürtgen Forest was not strategic. It accomplished no significant military objective. Military historians, including Charles MacDonald, who wrote the U.S. Army's official history, described it as a misconceived and basically fruitless battle that could have, and should have, been avoided. The Americans gained no vital terrain. They did not significantly damage German forces. They did not protect their flank, which was the original justification. They simply fed divisions into a meat grinder that destroyed units without achieving proportional results. The casualty figures tell the story. From September 19, 1944, to February 10, 1945, American forces suffered at least 24,000 battle casualties in the Hürtgen Forest. Dead, wounded, missing. An additional 9,000 soldiers were removed from combat due to non-battle casualties, trench foot, frostbite, combat exhaustion. These numbers represented entire divisions rendered combat ineffective. The 9th Infantry Division lost 4,500 men to gain 3,000 yards. The 28th Infantry Division's casualty rate in early November exceeded the division's ability to replace losses. 2 regiments suffered casualties equal to 100% of their fighting strength. The 4th Infantry Division, which included the 22nd Infantry Regiment, suffered 4,053 battle casualties and more than 2,000 non-battle casualties during 1 month in the forest. This represented the equivalent of 2 entire regimental combat teams, roughly 6,400 men. The 22nd Infantry alone reported casualties that gutted its rifle companies. Officer losses were catastrophic. Within 3 days of entering the forest, all 3 battalion commanders were casualties. Company-level leadership turned over multiple times. Some rifle companies lost every officer and senior NCO, leaving sergeants and even corporals in command of what remained of their units. German casualties were also severe, though less precisely documented. The 275th Infantry Division, Lengfeld's unit, was repeatedly reinforced with replacement battalions, fortress troops, and even Luftwaffe ground personnel pressed into infantry service. The division that entered the forest in November was substantially destroyed by December, but the Germans were defending, using prepared positions, fighting from fortifications they had spent weeks improving. Their casualty exchange ratio was favourable. They inflicted more losses than they suffered. From a purely tactical perspective, the German defence of Hürtgen Forest was successful. They delayed the American advance for months. They tied down multiple American divisions. They prevented the capture of the Ruhr River dams, which would have allowed the Americans to cross the river and advance into the Ruhr industrial region. Against this backdrop of industrial-scale violence, Lengfeld's decision to attempt a rescue stands out precisely because it contradicted the logic of the battle. The Hürtgen Forest was a place where human life had become a commodity measured in yards of territory gained or lost. Officers calculated acceptable casualty rates for limited objectives. Soldiers died for fire breaks and forest trails that had no names, that appeared on no maps, that meant nothing beyond the immediate tactical situation. The forest reduced warfare to its most basic, brutal form. Kill the enemy, hold the ground, survive another day. Yet Lengfeld heard a wounded American crying for help and decided to act. This was not a strategic decision. It served no tactical purpose. It did not advance German defensive objectives. It endangered his own soldiers by exposing them to potential American fire during the rescue attempt. It risked his own life for a man who, if saved, would eventually return to combat against German forces. By every calculation of military logic, Lengfeld's decision made no sense. That is precisely why it mattered. In a battle defined by its senselessness, by the systematic destruction of human beings for no strategic gain, one man chose to act as if individual human life had value beyond its military utility. The story of Friedrich Lengfeld could have ended in that casualty station in Freudsheim. Another German officer killed in action, buried in a military cemetery, forgotten as the war ground on toward its inevitable conclusion. The 22nd Infantry Regiment continued fighting in the Hürtgen Forest through the end of November. They took the town of Großhau on November 29th after brutal house-to-house fighting. By December 3rd, when the 4th Infantry Division was finally pulled out of the forest, the regiment had been shattered. Colonel Lanham's fighting machine, trained to an Apollo-Dations-Kurgtu, efficiency not matched at any time during the war, had been broken against the trees and mines of the Hürtgen. 2 weeks after leaving the forest, the depleted 4th Infantry Division found itself in Luxembourg, holding defensive positions, when the Germans launched their massive counter-offensive through the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge consumed what remained of the division's strength. The men who had survived the Hürtgen were thrown immediately into another desperate fight. There was no time to process what they had experienced, no opportunity to reflect on the friends lost in the forest. Survival demanded constant forward motion. The war continued. For the Germans, the Hürtgen Forest defense had been tactically successful but strategically meaningless. They had delayed the American advance, inflicted disproportionate casualties, demonstrated that determined defenders in favorable terrain could hold up forces with overwhelming material superiority. But they could not win. The industrial capacity of the United States, the Soviet Union's relentless pressure from the East, the complete Allied air superiority, the destruction of German oil production, the collapse of transportation networks, all combined to make German defeat inevitable. The Hürtgen Forest bought time. It bought nothing else. Lieutenant Friedrich Lengfeld was buried in the cemetery at Düren-Rosdorf, approximately 10 miles from where he died. His grave was number 38 in a cemetery containing 69 German war dead. It was a small cemetery, one of thousands scattered across Germany, each holding soldiers whose names meant nothing to anyone except their families. The war ended in May 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The surviving soldiers went home, or to prisoner of war camps, or to graves. The dead remained in cemeteries that slowly became maintained monuments rather than fresh burial grounds. Hubert Gies survived the war. He carried the memory of what his lieutenant had done. Gies had been there, had witnessed the rescue attempt, had seen Lengfeld step into the minefield knowing the risk. In the immediate post-war years, this memory had no particular significance. Germany was occupied, divided, focused on survival and rebuilding. The Eastern Front veterans, the men who had fought in Russia, dominated the narrative of German military service. Their battles had been larger, their casualties more severe, their stories more dramatic. A lieutenant dying in a minefield while attempting to rescue an American soldier was a footnote, if that. The Americans who had fought in the Hürtgen Forest had their own processing to do. The veterans of the 22nd Infantry Regiment formed a society, maintaining connections, gathering for reunions, remembering the men who had not come home. Among those veterans was John Ruggles, who had served as the regiment's executive officer during the battle. Ruggles continued his military career after the war, eventually retiring as a major general. He settled in Phoenix, Arizona. Like many veterans, he did not speak extensively about his combat experiences in the immediate post-war decades. The Hürtgen Forest remained a private memory, shared only with those who had been there. But as the years passed and the 50th anniversary of the battle approached, something shifted. Veterans who had spent decades not discussing the war found themselves wanting to return, to see the ground again, to honor the dead, to make sense of what had happened in that terrible forest. The Hürtgen War Cemetery in Germany had been established as a permanent memorial, holding 3,001 German soldiers who had died in the battle. The journey from silence to memorial took 50 years. In the early 1990s, as plans developed for the 50th anniversary commemorations of World War II, John Ruggles learned Hubert Gies's story. The details of how this information reached him are not completely documented, but the German veterans community had begun sharing their own accounts of the battle. Gies had written down his memories of Lengfeld's final action. That account circulated among German veterans of the 275th Infantry Division. Somehow, through the network of veterans organizations, historical researchers, and battlefield tour guides, the story reached the 22nd Infantry Regiment Society. Ruggles was struck by what he learned. Here was a German officer, fighting desperately in one of the war's most brutal battles, who had nonetheless tried to save an American soldier's life. The act contradicted everything the propaganda had said about the enemy during the war. It contradicted the dehumanization necessary to kill efficiently in combat. It revealed something that veterans on both sides understood but rarely articulated: that the men fighting on the other side were not monsters, but human beings caught in circumstances beyond their control, trying to maintain some shred of humanity in inhuman conditions. Ruggles proposed something unprecedented. The 22nd Infantry Regiment Society should erect a memorial to Friedrich Lengfeld, not to an American soldier, not to a unit or a battle, but to a specific German officer who had died trying to save one of their men. The proposal generated discussion. Some veterans questioned whether it was appropriate. The Germans had been the enemy. They had killed friends, brothers, comrades. The Hürtgen Forest was soaked with American blood. Why honor a German officer? But Ruggles persisted. His argument was simple and powerful. Lengfeld's act represented something that transcended nationality, ideology, and military necessity. It represented the best of what human beings could be, even in the worst circumstances. If American veterans could not honor that, what did it say about their own values? What did it say about what they believed they had been fighting for? The decision was made. The memorial would be built. On October 7th, 1994, exactly 50 years after the main phase of the Hürtgen Forest battle, a group of American veterans gathered at the Hürtgen War Cemetery. They were old men now, in their 70s, many using canes, some in wheelchairs. They had come from across the United States. John Ruggles was there, 86 years old, leading the ceremony. Hubert Geese was there, invited by the Americans, the only living witness to Lengfeld's death, now able to tell his story to the men who had fought on the other side. The memorial was simple. A stone monument, perhaps 4 feet tall, with a plaque bearing Lengfeld's name and the circumstances of his death. The inscription began with words adapted from the Gospel of John. "No man hath greater love than he who layeth down his life for his enemy." Below that, in German and English, the basic facts. Lieutenant Friedrich Lengfeld, 2nd Company, Fusilier Battalion 2, 175th Infantry Division, killed November 12, 1944, attempting to rescue a wounded American soldier from a minefield. The ceremony was attended by local German officials, veterans from both sides, and a handful of historians and journalists. It received no significant media coverage in the United States. Most Americans never learned it had happened. But for the men present, the significance was profound. They were acknowledging something that their own military tradition valued: courage, self-sacrifice, compassion for the wounded. They were acknowledging it in a man who had worn a different uniform, spoken a different language, fought for a cause that had been defeated and discredited. They were saying that these values transcended the circumstances of war. The Lengfeld Memorial stands today as possibly the only monument erected by American soldiers to honor a German officer's act of bravery during World War II. There is one other similar memorial, in the Netherlands, honoring Karl-Heinz Roche, another Wehrmacht soldier who acted with humanity toward Allied troops. These are exceptions. The overwhelming majority of World War II memorials honor the victors, remember the Allied dead, celebrate liberation. The moral clarity of the war against Nazi Germany is such that honoring individual German soldiers remains controversial, complicated, fraught with questions about complicity and responsibility. Yet the Lengfeld Memorial exists. It makes a specific, limited claim. It does not rehabilitate the Wehrmacht or excuse German aggression. It does not minimize Nazi atrocities or question the justice of Allied victory. It simply states that one man, in one moment, chose to act with compassion toward an enemy at great personal risk, and that this act deserves recognition. The memorial's existence forces a more complex understanding of what happened in the Hürtgen Forest and in the war more broadly. The soldiers fighting on both sides were not uniformly evil or uniformly good. They were human beings making choices under extreme conditions. Most choices were determined by military necessity, by orders, by the simple imperative to survive. But some choices transcended that framework. Lengfeld's decision to attempt a rescue was one of those choices. It achieved nothing militarily. It may not even have saved the American soldier's life, whose fate remains unknown. But it demonstrated that even in the Hürtgen Forest, even after weeks of brutal combat, even in a battle that exemplified the worst of industrial warfare, individual moral action remained possible. The broader lesson of the Lengfeld story relates to how we remember war. The dominant narrative of World War II, particularly in the United States, emphasizes the righteousness of the Allied cause, the necessity of defeating fascism, the heroism of those who fought. This narrative is not wrong. The war against Nazi Germany was just. The soldiers who fought it deserve honor. but focusing exclusively on national narratives and strategic outcomes can obscure the individual human experiences that constituted the war. Lengfeld's story reminds us that even just wars create situations where ordinary morality collapses, where survival becomes the only calculation, where killing becomes routine. And it reminds us that even in those situations, some people chose differently. The 22nd Infantry Regiment veterans who erected the memorial understood this. They had lived through the Hürtgen Forest. They knew what that battle had been. They knew the fear, the exhaustion, the numbing effect of constant casualties, the reduction of human beings to replacements and casualty statistics. They knew how easy it was to stop seeing the enemy as human. And precisely because they knew that, they recognized Lengfeld's act as extraordinary. He had refused that dehumanization at the cost of his own life. That refusal deserved recognition, even 50 years later, even across the divide of former enemies. The memorial's inscription, adapted from Scripture, captures this understanding. No man hath greater love than he who layeth down his life for his enemy. The original biblical verse speaks of laying down one's life for friends. The alteration is deliberate and significant. Lengfeld did not die for his friends, his comrades, his nation. He died attempting to save a man who, by every definition of the moment, was his enemy. That inversion of expected loyalties, that expansion of moral obligation beyond the boundaries of nationality and military necessity, was what made his act remarkable. It was what made it worthy of memory. It was why, 50 years later, old American soldiers stood in a German cemetery and honored a man they had once fought against. The story that began with screams in a minefield ended with a memorial that asked uncomfortable questions about duty, compassion, and what we owe to those we call enemies. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.